Doctoral program, Christian Persecution and Martyrdom, Lecture 14, Part B. This is Protestant Persecution of Baptists, Part 3 that we're in. Church of England, just it as a whole in these other years, 1626 to 1689. Excuse me. Red text. The Anglican Church continued to persecute those who tried to worship independently until almost the end of the 17th century, so the 1600s. So if you were a church that didn't want to go along with the Church of England, you're going to be persecuted. The only ones that I know of that are in the history books that we can find are Baptists. Maybe you can find some others in this time period, but I know of none. So that's interesting. It's not like I'm just looking at the Baptists and excusing all the others. And there could be some other smaller groups that just didn't have a name, just kind of in one little city. They met in one church. It could be. But I have no knowledge of that. So maybe you can tell me if that's the case. Well, let's go on. Black text number 1 here. Many Baptist preachers had long prison terms in 17th century England. Francis Bamfield died in prison after spending the last 9 years of his life in bonds. John Miller was confined 10 years. Henry Forty spent 12 years in prison. Red text, and these are famous guys, relatively. At least they're preacher pastors. How about red text? John Bunyan. He wrote his famous Pilgrim's Progress while languishing in prison for 12 long years, unable to care for his wife and beloved blind daughter. Black text. Joseph Wright lay in Maidstone jail for 20 years. George Founds died in Gloucester jail. Samuel Howe died in prison in 1640 and was buried beside a roadway because the Church of England refused to allow him to be buried in a cemetery. The attitude of many within the Church of England toward dissident Christians in that day is illustrated by the publication in 1644 of "The Dippers Dipped, or the Anabaptists Dunked, and Plunged over head and ears at a disputation in Southwark." They had long titles back then. This rabidly anti-Baptist work was written by Daniel Featley, an Anglican minister. Featley called for the physical destruction of Anabaptists and other schismatics. Well, I guess there were other schismatics back then. Consider a choice excerpt. Now, of all heretics and schismatics, I guess there's a lot of them, the Anabaptists, in 3 regards, ought to be most carefully looked unto, and severely punished, if not utterly exterminated and banished out of the church and kingdom. Featley described the Anabaptists in Vienna being tied together in chains and drowned in the river. Bible believers were viciously persecuted during the reigns of King Charles II and King James II. That's later on. You can see the years there, time periods. The Act of Uniformity in 1662 subjected many to beatings and imprisonment. The First Conventicle Act in 1664 forbade all religious assemblies that did not conform to the Church of England. Penalties were severe fines and imprisonment, and for a third offense, banishment to the American colonies for 7 years. Hey, all right, let's do that. The 5 Mile Act in 1665 forbade nonconformist preachers to go within 5 miles of any city or town that had a Church of England congregation. Red text. Between 1660 and 1689, so you need to know those years, some 70,000 men and women suffered under religious persecution in England, and 8,000 perished. Black text. And tens of millions of dollars were paid in fines. The long arm of red text, the Anglican Church, also brought persecution to Bible believers in America before her independence. Black text. The Virgin Colony was Anglican. The Virginia Colony was Anglican. And in 1643, the governor unleashed persecution against dissenters. Many were whipped, branded, incarcerated, fined, and driven out of the colony, Virginia. Red text. Finally, in 1689, the Toleration Act was passed in England, which greatly reduced the pressure on all dissenters, giving them liberty of conscience of conscience, and making it an offense to disturb anyone else's worship. Thus, it was not until 155 years after its establishment that the Church of England stopped persecuting. That's significant, right? Well, I think it is. Black text. Protestants in America. Red text. The Protestants who settled in America, though fleeing religious persecution themselves, persecuted Baptists. Where? In America. Protestants that came on over to settle, to have freedom of religion. They persecuted the Baptists, black text, and Quakers, and others who differed from them. Red text, until the time of the American independence and the formation of the United States Constitution. So there's another group that might be, at least was there in the new colonies of America. Quakers might have been in England. I would assume they were, because they weren't the founders of America as far as I know. Just don't know how long they've been around for. Black text. We will give two examples of this. Massachusetts. It was founded by the colony of Pilgrims in Plymouth in 1620 and by the Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Red text. So you have Pilgrims and Puritans there, sorry. Red text. The Pilgrims were separatists who had been forced to flee the persecution of the Church of England. They had spent a brief time in the Netherlands, then traveled by ship to America. While in the Netherlands, they enjoyed some measure of religious liberty, but they did not grant the same to others. They practiced infant baptism and denounced Anabaptists. So they were separatists from the Church of England, but were kind of like the reformers, in a way, of the Catholic Church. But they still practiced infant baptism, definitely weren't Baptists. The Puritans, they sound good, they're pure. The Puritans were Anglicans who desired some reformation of the Church of England, but who did not separate from it. There were separatists and the non-separatists. Both were Church of England likes. They brought from England the false concept of a state church and a persecuting spirit. Black text. Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts in 1635, a learned and zealous man who could read the Bible in Greek and Hebrew. He was an ordained Anglican minister, and at the time he came to America, he still held to infant baptism. While living in Plymouth, Williams preached to the native Indians. He learned their language and made many friends among them, including two of their chiefs. In 1634, he was appointed the pastor of the Anglican congregation in Salem. But later in 1635, he was banished from the colony for preaching new and dangerous opinions. He was given 6 weeks to leave, and in January he was forced into the wilderness in the midst of a brutal New England winter. The Indians helped him, and so he was banished by the Anglicans there. The Church of Englandites, the Puritans and the Pilgrims apparently that were there weren't the Baptists. The Indians helped him, and in June he traveled by canoe up a river to Rhode Island and established the settlement of Providence. Others joined him from Massachusetts, and this place became a bastion of religious liberty. Where? Well, eventually Rhode Island, but starting off in Providence, Rhode Island. Black text in March 1639. Red text. Roger Williams was publicly immersed in baptism, and the First Baptist Church of Rhode Island was formed. This is commonly considered the oldest Baptist church in America. Now that's debated amongst independent fundamental Baptists, but something to research with church history. Black text. In March 1644, Williams obtained a charter from the King of England to establish Rhode Island. Red text. The first law against the Baptists in America was made in Massachusetts. Massachusetts today is pretty liberal. Not really pro-Christian. Black text. The law in November 1644. The law threatened severe punishments against Anabaptists. At the time, there were no Baptist churches in Massachusetts. That year, Thomas Painter was whipped for denying infant baptism. In February of 1646, William Whitter and John Wood of Lynn were publicly rebuked and fined for denying infant baptism. John Spur was fined for the same crime. Obadiah Holmes was beaten with 30 strokes of a 3-corded whip for preaching in a friend's home in Lynn, Massachusetts. I guess he was preaching without the authority of the Church of Massachusetts. Well, after the First Baptist Church, let me get a little drink here. My tongue's sticking to the roof of my mouth. Yeah. After the First Baptist Church was finally formed in Massachusetts in about 1656, the members spent most of their time in courts and prisons. They were often fined, and some of them were banished. The pastor of this church, Thomas Gould, was imprisoned for his faith. When this church later built a meeting house, the civil authorities in 1680, this is in America, nailed the doors shut and ordered them not to meet. A Second Baptist Church was not formed in Massachusetts until 1749. So now you see why saying First Baptist or Second Baptist meant something. It wasn't just trying to beat out the other Baptists. It was, we got a Baptist church finally started in this God-forsaken city. This was in the town of Sturbridge, and many of the members were imprisoned, fined, and had their property confiscated. Another Baptist church formed in 1761 in the town of Ashfield and was treated in the same manner. So this persecution continued against many other Baptist churches that were established in those days and did not end until Massachusetts became a colony of the United States and formed their Constitution in 1780. Through the efforts of the Baptists and other lovers of religious liberty, this contained the Bill of Rights guaranteeing freedom of faith, 1780, amen. The first settlers to Virginia were mostly from England, and they established Anglican churches. By the Acts of 1623, 1643, and 1661, all citizens were required to follow that religion and doctrine. Acts of the Red Text Virginia, Black Text Assembly of 1659, 1662, 1663, Red Text Virginia required that all children be baptized and prohibited the assembling of Quakers and other dissidents. So there's some others. Baptists were the largest, well known, of course, believed right. Black Text, the Anglican ministers were supported by the taxes of the citizens. On June 4, 1768, several Baptists were arrested in Spotsylvania and imprisoned for almost 6 weeks. December 1770, William Weber and Joseph Anthony were arrested and cast into prison for 4 months for preaching in Chesterfield, Virginia. 1774, all of the Baptist preachers in Piscataway were arrested and sent to prison. These were John Waller, John Shackelford, and Robert Ware. Altogether, some 30 Baptist preachers spent time in prison in Virginia, some as many as 4 different times. These persecutions continued until Virginia was brought into the new Union of the United States. Red Text. In spite of the persecutions, the Baptist churches grew rapidly in Virginia during those days. Black Text, the first was formed in 1767, and the second in 1769. Red Text, within 4 years, there were about 50 Baptist churches in Virginia. There you go. Black Text. This was taken from it was from wayoflife.org. Excerpts from it. This is the end of these excerpts, as I'm done. We're done with that. Next, you're going to have lectures, 2 lectures that are notes I carefully put together, fill in the blank types. You need to watch the video carefully. There's a lot of information, especially in the first section of the video. It's in 2 parts. Same video, about 59 minutes long. Lecture 15 will be about 17, 18 minutes of it, and lecture 16, the remainder, but there's more information, I think, in the first. And you got to really pay attention and stop and pause it, read, kind of follow along. Goes chronologically, just be careful on that. And, and then there's also the warning, this is the Jewish Holocaust. I have the warning that, so pay attention here, there's images that are concerning, that are very graphic, even too graphic for me at times. Not that I like looking at them, but to where I just said, that's it. I'm not going to watch the rest of this little segment. But I had to verify where it ended. So I put, you'll see the warning and those segment times down. If you're concerned about it, then you need to follow the segment, keep track of the time. You know, I'm just trying to help you. This is the cleanest one I could find of the videos out there that had good information. There were others that were worse. I just had to stop those. I couldn't go on. So there's pictures that are offensive to me and maybe to you too, and definitely children shouldn't be watching these. But they have dead bodies, naked, emaciated bodies. Just with their cheek curled and just their eyes open wide, and they're laying there, sometimes close-ups of them, in kind of black and white film, but still. Then they pile the bodies into little wagons and carts to take them away, piled high, and then they throw the bodies into a pit and their bodies just fall. And it's so gruesome. They treat them, the Nazis were treating them just like wood. They even called them that. And there's other things like that. So I marked those down. Just be careful on those, and don't look forward to watching those. Oh no! You watch a little bit of that, and you go, "Dear God in heaven, what happened back then?"